Welcome classic rock fans for another worst to best ranking video, and today we're looking at the albums of Supertramp. If you're new to this channel, please do click like, subscribe and check that notification bell, and check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done at Classic Album Review. It's always much appreciated. Well, that's that said. Anyway, enough of this piffle, let's get on with it, shall we? Number 11 is Free as a Bird from 1987. My word, this is certainly their weakest album overall, as the band tried to revamp their sound, employing more modern and lots of synth dance beats and drum machines. Check out the opening track, It's Alright. Now there's an ironically titled number if ever there was one. The oily 80s era production is grating and makes Phil Collins stuff sound edgy. Like a lot of 80s albums, this hasn't aged well. I suppose the best tracks on it would be An Awful Thing to Waste, and It Doesn't Matter. Number 10 is Famous Last Words from 1982. As a follow-up to Breakfast in America, this album is really disappointing. There are two standout singles on this album, the rather poignant My Kind of Lady and the effervescent cumulus of It's Raining Again. Songs purposely tailored for top 40 radio. In fact, Cream magazine said of this album, "This stuff is so soddenly bland already that the Muzak folks are going to have their work cut out for them." This album is enjoyable on a surface level, but it lacks the keenness and edge they had on their earlier albums. All that is replaced with this romantically inclined fluff from Roger Hodgson. Even musically, the album seems flavourless, lacking the proficiency and reputation their early material garnered. It's full of these positively coruscates with this poppy, tuneful sparkle, but it lacks the darker tones that Rick Davies would bring to the proceedings. I think he must have been making the tea when they did this album. There was a lot of conflict between Roger Hodgson and Rick Davies over the direction of the band, Hodgson favouring a more poppy, commercial direction, and Davies wanted to pursue more sort of jazzier, proggy overtones. In fact, it has to be said that the best track on the album is the Davies composition, Waiting So Long, with its more proggy leanings. Number 9 is Indelibly Stamped from 1971, an album that's perhaps better than its reputation. Unfortunately, the only attention this album tends to receive is for its dreadful artwork. The lack of success of the more progressive album that precedes this one saw the band questioning or trying to work out what their real identity was. And this album, consequently, is a real smorgasbord of different styles, with the band genre hopping between pop, rock, folk, jazz, even some country. I rather like the track Travelled, as it seems very much like a holdover from the 1960s. But as I said, this album suffers with the band not really sure who or what they were going to be. This album devoid of a distinctive sound or style. It's all over the place really, in this rather tasteless splodge, a bit like the cover art. Number 8 is Slow Motion from 2002. The albums recorded after Hodgson's departure were perhaps interesting, but failed to capture the glory days of that classic Supertramp lineup. It's not to say that these albums were bad. There's some interesting moments on them. I particularly like the opening track on this album, Slow Motion, which is quite good, I think. But this album suffers from those strong song structures that Hodgson brought to the table. And also the production on this is somewhat muddy and cluttered, which certainly affects one's enjoyment of this album. The songs on here do have some semblance of representing that classic Supertramp line of songs dealing with alienation, for example. But Rick seems to want to explore more bluesy jazz grooves with some extended instrumental jams. Some critics have suggested that these are slightly reminiscent of later Steely Dan. I'm not sure I agree though. Some of the tracks on here are okay, like 10th Avenue Breakdown, Dead Man's Blues, are fine numbers really, but a lot of it just feels very average. Especially that reworking of that Gold Rush number, which is an older Supertramp number I believe, and that has that southern Cajun country feel to it. Oh dear. Number 7 is Something's Never Changed from 1997. Very much in accordance with the title, the music on here does seem somewhat formulaic, churning out their brand of jazz, light, funk-inflected pop. Not that I have anything against it, I rather like the sound of this band. I like the opening song, It's a Hard World. I think it's a fine number, but nevertheless this album lacks those anthemic tunes that classic Supertramp would always rely upon. Probably due to Hodgson's departure, of course, taking the long way home to his own solo career. But despite missing those catchy earworms of old, there's some pretty decent stuff on here, which just shows what a great writer Rick Davies is. The band resets itself with Mark Hart on guitar, keyboards and vocals, as well as Lee Thornburg trumpet, trombone, vocals, We get a variety of wonderful songs, including You Win, I Lose, Sooner or Later, with references to that Santana-like Latin jazz feel, as well as the bluesy Help Me Down That Road. It's a real smorgasbord of impressions. Live to Love You feels like a bit of a misstep, but it's an album worth checking out, even if it's devoid of all those Roger Hodgson-like trillings. Number 6 is Supertramp from 1970. A strong debut album, progressive for the most part, but it's a style that the band disregarded as they blossomed commercially throughout the 1970s. The album featured drummer Bob Miller and guitarist Richard Palmer, who were subsequently replaced with Kevin Curry and Frank Farrell. Interesting, AllMusic says of this album: quite a bit different then to their radio and AOR material, Supertramp is inundated with pretentious instrumental meandering, with greater emphasis and attention granted to the keyboards and guitars than to the writing and to the overall effluence of the music. I disagree though, there's some lovely moments on this album. Tracks like Words, Unspoken, Surely Nothing to Show, this fusion of passion and subtlety, which is explored beautifully in the 12-minute number on here, Try Again. Hodgson uses numerous instruments on here, which broadens the palette of this record. Both he and Davies are absolutely excellent. It's clear that this band's strength was going to be in its writing. I read one critic that said this album is heavily influenced by the prog albums of its day. In fact, he goes on to say that I suspect they've been listening to Genesis' Trespass too often, as its pastoral shadings are all over this. But if I'm not mistaken, I think this Supertramp album actually came out before the Genesis Trespass album, so I'm not sure that's correct. Number 5 is Brother Where You Bound from 1985. Rick Davies was able to steer the band to his own musical styles and tastes, veering away from the poppier sensibilities that Roger Hodgson favoured, returning to a more progressive rock style with jazz and blues influences. Progsphere said, "This is crossover prog at its very best." It's hard to disagree with him, really. The lyrics are politically orientated. There is a thematic heaviness to this album, which contrasts with much of the music on it. The sound of this album has been described by AllMusic as crystalline, and that's very much in part to co-producer David Kirschenbahn and Supertramp engineer Norman Hall, who do an absolutely wonderful job. I absolutely love the track Cannonball, which certainly leans towards Rick Davies' more jazzy proclivity, shall we say. Other tracks, like No In Between, begins with a lovely piano melody. Better Days is rather bleak, but the dramatic thrust of it is embellished by Scott Page's flute solos. George Orwell's 1984 forms the opening narration. And it's funny, at this time there were so many politically charged albums, or politically themed albums, or dystopian albums. Camel's Stationary Traveller, of course, looks at the aftermath of the erection of the Berlin Wall. Berlin Wall went up in 1961, if I'm not mistaken. The album came out in 1984. I could be wrong there. Of course, Jethro Tull's Under Wraps is all about Cold War intrigue, and let's not forget the dystopian narrative that is Pink Floyd's The Wall. And speaking of Pink Floyd, David Gilmour contributes some distorted and searing guitar lines to this album. Rick Davies certainly demonstrates his more proggy leanings with the 16-minute part epic Brother Where You Bound, which he wanted to put on the last album, but it was vetoed by Roger Hodgson, that is, not Waters. Number 4 is Breakfast in America from 1979. This was a huge commercial success. It's an overall pleasure to listen to. Rick's contributions starting with the great opener Gone Hollywood, then Goodbye Stranger and Oh Darling, which many have argued, saves side 1 from too much lightweight pop, shall we say. And side 2 begins with some equally strong numbers, with Roger's heartfelt Lord Is It Mine, Take the Long Way Home, and Rick's more edgy Another Nervous Wreck and Casual Conversations, culminating in the big final of Child of Vision. This album is what results when a perfect balance is struck between Rick Davies and Roger Hodgson. Interestingly, Stephen Holden said Breakfast in America is definitely an improvement on the meandering Genesis-like esoterica of the previous albums, and certainly delighted in the post-Beatles keyboard-centered English art rock that strikes the shrewdest possible balance between quasi-symphonic classicism and rock and roll. It's understandable why this album often tops people's lists, why it's their favourite album, but I prefer the Supertramp albums that have darker shadows and more jazzier tones to them. Number 3 is Even in the Quietest Moments from 1977. The aptly titled Even in the Quietest Moments sees this band indulging their own quietest moments, spending this album in a very subdued and hushed mood, as Steve Erlewine points out in his review. The cover photo picture of a snow-covered piano sitting on a mountain gives a good indication of what the album sounds like. It's elegant yet mildly absurd, witty but kind of obscure. And the opening single, Give a Little Bit, is their biggest single to date, even bigger than the Logical song, which seems illogical to me. You could argue the album certainly doesn't boast a song that comes closer to the commercial potential of that one, but Downstream comes pretty close, I think. It doesn't have the same hook. Most of the other tracks are clocking well over sort of 6 minutes, which isn't going to please your average radio station. It's certainly a transitional album, bridging that gap between Crime of the Century and the forthcoming Breakfast in America. Interestingly, Robert Christgau said of this album, "Unlike most progressive rock, which is pretentious background schlock that's all too hard to ignore, the album is modest background schlock that sounds good when it slips into your ear." New producer Peter Henderson establishes a warmer sound on this album with great melodies and appropriately proggy instrumental sections. You could say the album produces lovely soundscapes and atmospheres. We get the sensational from now on with its evocative moods and atmospheres, followed by the epic production of Fool's Overture with its multiple sections and collages of sound and styles. Number 2 is Crisis. What Crisis from 1975? Like Crime of the Century, you get more blending of some great prog influences with pop sensibilities, with most of the lyrics are kind of vignettes, focusing on the loss of communication between people and the absence of moral values in today's world. Rolling Stone hated this album, panned it in fact. It said the only crisis is trying to get through 2 sides of this record. Personally, I think the songwriting is sharp, attentive, and the lyrics, like the previous album, showcase Supertramp invoking emotion and that melancholic sense of unease. Even simple tracks like Lady and Just a Normal Day blend in nicely with the album's warm personality and charmingly subtle mood and humour, no better illustrated, of course, than on the cover artwork. This album, of course, is very guitar-dominated, as opposed to the very piano-led Crime of the Century. I particularly adore the acoustic Sister Moonshine. And then comes Lady, of course, which is quite a bouncy pop song, morphing into a dynamic proggy middle section and ending on an a cappella barbershop quartet. It's certainly a complex, shaded and diverse record. Davis did come up with the cover concept and title, the title of which is, of course, lifted from a line from Day of the Jackal. Number 1 is Crime of the Century from 1974. This is the band finding their sound with those expansive art rock arrangements graced by saxophones and Hodgson's voice quivering between proggy self-reflection and the pop pretensions of Dreamer, and the cynicism expressed in Davis's voice in Bloody Well Right is just absolutely awesome. They could be considered snarky collegiate elitists according to AllMusic, an art rock variation on Steely Dan, or perhaps maybe a less difficult 10cc. Robert Christgau said this band are like Queen, but without all the preening. This album is certainly lighter than their prog contemporaries, threatening to float off at any minute. In a world that addresses such themes as loneliness, isolation, alienation, mental stability, as well as personal responsibility, all presented in a stunning display of musicianship and musical prowess. From the opening and plaintive wail of that harmonica with School to the closing piano riff and orchestral fade-out on Crime of the Century, the songs just flow through one another in this continuous musical journey. And speaking of musical journeys, consider Rudy for a moment. Its multiple sections evocative and thrilling, each one better than the last, telling the story of this very lost and lonely soul. This is just dripping with introspective melancholy. Produced by Ken Scott, this album is a sonic masterpiece. I think it got to number 5 in the US and it was number 1 in Canada, I believe. And actually stayed on the charts for, I think, for over 2 years. What an album, eh? Well, there you have it. That's my ranking of all the Supertramp albums. If you've enjoyed this video, please do share it. Do click like, subscribe, and check that notification bell. I think I may have said this. I can't remember. And check some of the links below this video for ways you can support the sterling work done at Classic Album Review. It's always much appreciated. Become a Patreon. There's a fine body of work on there now. Anyway, I'll leave you with my closing salvo, which is hope you're well, staying safe, and of course that you keep listening.